And we're live. It's Friday, October 18th, 2024, 4 o'clock p.m. The week is sliding slowly its way to the end. And here we are, getting ever closer to a presidential election, feeling the tension in the October air, and all doing our part to make October as tension-filled as possible. We welcome to the show today the only member of Congress ever to serve in the House of Representatives who has made a video about me in Hindi. Tom Malinowski also has the distinction, I think, of being alone among all members of Congress in the history of the House of Representatives to appear on In Lieu of Fun from the rotunda of the Capitol. And that is, I suspect, a record that will stand for a while because he has more sense of drama than most non-Marjorie Taylor Greene members of Congress. Tom, it is good to see your face.
Thank you, Benjamin. I didn't think I'd be compared to Marjorie Taylor Greene that quickly in this interview, but, it's an honor.
Well, it was not a hostile comparison. You do share a flair for the dramatic.
Well, I'm deeply honored. I didn't make a video about you in Hindi. I just found it. It was out there.
Yeah, that's correct. It was a very long flight. Yeah, Tom, I don't know if that video is still out there somewhere, but
It's somewhere.
I don't know whether it says something odder about you or about me. But I just want to say, in our long-running battle about killer drones, I've had occasion to wonder whether the Ukraine war has made you rethink your position at all.
Well, I mean, assumes a lot of background knowledge among our audience.
It's true. Maybe we'll get to that later in the show. We are not allowed to have fun anymore. But I heard a rumor that Tom Malinowski was rallying Polish votes in Polish American votes in key swing states. And I thought I didn't want to leave the American off because all of a sudden then we would have an RNC ad about how Tom Malinowski was getting illegal immigrant votes so we've got to be precise in how we speak. And I just thought we should talk about it. The time is creeping in its petty pace until the last syllable of recorded time to gather votes and to encourage people to vote. And so I wanted to hear what you guys were up to and what the ambition is and what you're trying to do.
Trying to save America, obviously. And it just so happens that the states that will decide this election in all likelihood have the highest concentration of Polish Americans, Ukrainian Americans, other East European Americans in the country, Michigan, Wisconsin, and particularly Pennsylvania. And, I'm a Polish American. I was born in Poland. I'm also the only person ever to be born in independent Poland to have served in the U.S. Congress. I know that's not as important as the milestone that you referred to, but
it's milestone number 3. We're going to go through the onlys. So far, we're up to 3 with.
Yeah, that's one of them. And, a little relevant to this election because, I'll say that obviously I'm a Democrat. As an American, I've been a Democrat. As a Polish American, I've been nonpartisan, neutral. There's never been in my lifetime a Polish reason or a Ukrainian reason or a Lithuanian reason to vote for one party or another, because Democratic, Republican presidents have all pretty much basically been pro-NATO, pro-American allies, pro-democracy versus dictatorship, and they haven't thought well of Russian imperialism until this guy. And so all of these folks, many of whom, probably most of whom, have trended Republican in recent elections because they're more socially conservative, many of them are Catholic, now have this additional reason, I hope, to think about not voting for the Republican ticket. And all it takes is, if it's a close election, a very small percentage of them to shift, to basically decide the whole thing.
Right, so let's talk about that. There was a very disturbing article by Josh Rogan in the Washington Post the other day about Ukrainian Americans in Pennsylvania. The Ukrainians that I know, and I've gotten to know a lot of them over the last couple years, find this trend in which older, more settled Ukrainians are kind of Republican, almost the way sort of Cuban Americans in Florida are kind of historically. There's just sort of an anti-Soviet combined with a sort of social conservative, um, uh, white ethnic, in this case not Catholic but Orthodox conservatism, and the younger ones are incredulous because of Trump. And so I'm curious. When you think of Polish Americans, I think of Cleveland, and it does have this, like, it's sort of like the least likely Democratic voting group. And so I'm curious what the receptivity to your message, like, hey, which basically boils down to how comfortable are you with Poland not existing in 8 years? What's the reaction when you talk to Polish Americans about that?
I was in Chicago about a week ago speaking at the annual conference of the Polish American Congress, which is the kind of old line Polish American group. And, like, they were celebrating the 25th anniversary of Poland's membership in NATO, among other things. And I was the Kamala Harris spokesperson at that meeting. I was the sent by the campaign. And I think I would have been lucky to have half the room. And one of the points I made was like, you're celebrating Poland being in NATO for 25 years. We need to keep America in NATO. That's like on the ballot in this election. And that argument is received well by some people. Others will just boo and say, you don't know what you're talking about. But here's the thing. Elections are simple math. It's subtraction and addition. Kamala Harris is not trying to win. She doesn't have to win all of the Ukrainian Americans, although arguably she should. She's not trying to win necessarily even a majority of the Polish Americans. All you have to do to win a close election is shift a few thousand more people your way in these states who otherwise would not have been, based on this issue. And
Right.
if she can do that, if we can do that, then she wins. It's that simple.
So do we have a sense of what the Polish American vote and the Ukrainian American vote was last time, and how many people? I mean, I don't have a sense that we have granular enough ethnic data to kind of know the answer to that question, but do you have an instinct about it?
Yeah, so there has been some pseudo research done on this, on the Polish American vote. It's not precise enough for anybody to seriously say they know the answer, but there's at least some evidence that, well, there's absolute clear evidence that it was an overwhelmingly Democratic constituency through the 30s, 40s, 50s. And then, like a lot of white ethnics in the Midwest, they became Reagan Democrats. And so Polish Americans voted for Reagan in large numbers. they kind of like Bill Clinton, and Clinton he brought Poland into NATO. They like George Bush. Um, there's some evidence that a majority voted for Trump in 2016, and I believe that. There's some evidence that maybe a majority, certainly there was some shift towards Biden in 2020. And all I care about is the shift, right? It's not the aggregate. It's can we get, I keep coming back to this, the few thousand folks who in a normal election would vote Republican because they're socially conservative or whatever other reasons, to say, you know what, maybe I'll vote for my Republican senator, but I can't let this guy who's going to kiss Putin's ass and encourage the Russians, in his own words, encourage the Russians to do whatever the hell they want to our allies to run this country. That's just weird. It's not what Reagan would have done or Bush or any of the Republicans I voted for before.
So how do you know if you're being effective in this? Like all get out the vote and persuasion efforts that operate below the level of something that you can poll, there's a certain level at which you feel like you're being effective, but it's very hard to actually ascertain. Do you have any way of knowing if it's working, or are you just in I'm doing everything I can and it's not up to me whether it works mode?
You can't know empirically. Look, I've seen polling data. This is as far as we can go empirically. I've seen polling data that shows that Central East European Americans in those states overwhelmingly support Ukraine. I've seen polling data, and I know the Biden and now Harris campaign have this, that shows that the basic argument that Trump will kowtow to Putin and Harris will stand up to Putin is one of the best performing arguments with all voters, Republican, Democrat, and Independent, not just those of Central European descent. So, that's good news. And it's certainly enough evidence for us to have decided to put these ads in the field and to make a major effort to persuade these voters. But we're not going to know until after the election. And even then it's tough because you don't have exit polls in America that where you can know
that are going to distinguish between Polish Americans and other whites.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at certain voting precincts in counties where Polish Americans are maybe a plurality, but they're not a majority in any county. So even then, it's going to take a little bit of guesswork.
So what is the scope of the activity? You're speaking at the Polish American Congress, you're running some ads. Like, what are the list of things that you guys are doing?
But the biggest project has been ads micro-targeting Polish, Ukrainian, other Central European voters, primarily in Pennsylvania. We've raised enough to run a full campaign in Pennsylvania through Election Day. This is micro-targeting, so you actually can, we don't know how people vote by ethnicity, but you can target digital ads to people by their ethnic group. And so we have 3 ads that are all kind of rooted in the history and culture of Poland and Ukraine, and that harken back to past American presidents of both parties who stood up to Russia. And so we'll see. Those will be running. And then the rest is, there are Ukrainian Americans for Harris, Polish Americans for Harris. There are lots of local events. I was just in Wilkes-Barre in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, near Scranton. That's one of the biggest concentrations of Polish Americans in the country. Speaking to a pierogi dinner with 100 Polish Americans who were very receptive to this message.
That's interesting. That's, I think of Wilkes-Barre as the kind of place that Kamala Harris would not be especially attractive as a candidate. It's sort of hardcore Reagan Democrat territory, and I would have thought of it as real Trump territory.
Yeah, it's one of the swingiest areas of Pennsylvania. And look, I don't want to mislead anyone. There are a lot of Polish Americans and many other Americans in that part of the state who are going to vote for Trump.
Right.
And the goal of the Harris campaign is you run up big numbers where you're strong and you limit your losses where you're weak. And then you fight like hell for places and people who are kind of in between.
So there are many different kinds of Polish Americans and Ukrainian Americans, and let me group them into two broad categories. There's people like you who actually were born there. And some of them like you grew up here and some of them are relatively recent immigrants, for our purposes relevant, long enough to have citizenship and vote, but not necessarily long enough to have lost an accent. And then there are old communities that have been here since the teens and 20s at least, and probably longer, that are still self-identified, but probably aren't language speaking, and are identified principally by geographic concentration. And I'm curious whether to what extent the older communities are, how strongly identified with Poland they still are, or are they just I mean, at what point do they become sort of, much more generic Catholic white people?
Mm-hmm. It varies. You won't be surprised to hear me say this. Of the families that have been here for generations, some of them are Polish in name only. Like they know they're Polish. They've got a ski at the end of their name, but that's pretty much it. Some of them are Polish on holidays and their foods that they make and traditions that they mark. It doesn't go much beyond that. But even among those multi-generation in America families, there are a lot of folks who also have some sense of what it means historically to be Polish. This idea of a little country standing up courageously against Stalin and against Hitler and against the evil in the world, and it's part of this Polish ethos that I was in this meeting with about 100 Polish Americans in Wilkes-Barre yesterday, and these were overwhelmingly folks who didn't speak more than 2 words of Polish and whose grandparents or great-grandparents were the immigrants. But when I hearken back to those stories about the Warsaw Uprising and 1939 and Hitler and Stalin, and I quoted some of the things that Trump has said, like, I'm the apple of Putin's eye. And I asked them, could you imagine Harry Truman saying that about Stalin or Reagan saying that about Gorbachev? The room was emotionally exactly where I would have hoped that they would be. And again, even if only 10% of that community
Right.
moved by any of that, that's 10% of 800,000 people in Pennsylvania, similar numbers in Wisconsin and Michigan.
Richard, you have a question?
Indeed, I do. Hello, Congressman. I wanted to ask about the influence of the Catholic bishops and of the Catholic Church among Polish American voters. I know that that's a simple question with probably a complicated answer because it breaks out generationally and by how many people continue to adhere to to their Catholicism. So And I'm just curious about that, what the influence is, and also the fact that I guess we also want to take into account that bishops are changing since Francis has been the Pope.
Nobody is one-dimensional. We're all subject to all kinds of different influences. And Polish Americans are devoutly Catholic, and the Catholic influence in a normal election would steer them, in most cases, towards a Republican candidate on the abortion issue, most of all. But there are these other things, and are they going to vote as Catholic Americans? Are they going to vote as Polish Americans? Are they going to vote as Michigan Americans? The answer is all three. And some of them have their minds made up firmly one way or another, just like it's true of any community in America right now. Those who don't, who are still persuadable voters, by definition, whatever a conservative bishop might be telling them is not enough. Otherwise, they'd be persuaded already. And so my goal is to remind them of this part of their identity and to remind them of this important reason to vote against Trump.
So I'm interested in your sense more generally of how the campaign, which I guess we should now call the election, is going, since voting is underway in all kinds of places, including Pennsylvania. It's a kind of cliche to say it's a coin flip, nobody knows anything, which is true. Do you have more to say than that?
No. What can any of us say?
I don't know. People, fill up hours and hours of time on CNN and MSNBC saying all kinds of things.
I understand. We have some time to fill, but I have no secret knowledge that other people don't have. I see the same polls. I guess that's a pun in this conversation.
Yeah, you see both the same polls, POLLS, and different polls, POLES.
We have no polls of polls. I think, it feels 50-50 to me. It's very depressing to say that. If we win, I'm going to be incredibly relieved, but not happy, because how can you be happy to live in an America in which every election is a 1-point victory of democracy over fascism? We can't keep doing this, because at some point it's going to go the other way. And if it goes the other way, it may not come back. So I think what we haven't yet really come to terms with is how it got this way and what needs to change to fix it. The solution can't just be fighting tooth and nail for the reasonable, moderate candidate to win by a thread in every election.
Right. There's an underlying problem that has to be identified and addressed.
Yeah.
If worse comes to worse, on Guy Fawkes Day /Election Day /Ben Wittes's birthday, how are you going to spend the next 4 years?
I have no idea. I have no idea. If we win, I want to spend the next 4 years working on that problem.
And working on it, I mean, most people think of you in your executive branch life. And for those who don't know, Tom was Assistant Secretary at State for DHL, or Democracy, Human Rights, and DRL, sorry. Democracy, Human, DHL, sorry, that you delivered packages to the rest of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Most people think of you in your executive branch life as a foreign policy guy, but this problem is fundamentally a domestic problem, although it has foreign elements. What does what does that make you think about doing?
Look, I'm still someone who thinks a lot about foreign policy. I did a lot of that even as a member of Congress representing New Jersey. But if you ask me, what is the biggest foreign policy problem facing our country? And if you ask me, what is the biggest domestic problem facing our country? I would give you exactly the same answer. It's this. It's the fact that we have, in the last 20 years, completely transformed the way people in America and all over the world get information about the world around us in a way that's been, I think, catastrophically destructive. Everything has been fragmented, and we no longer have human beings who try to be responsible, at least some of the time, deciding what news, what information we see. It's a software algorithm that...
Right, it's a software algorithm, as we discussed yesterday on the show, that decides whether the public on Facebook can see my open letter to former Ambassador Anatoly Antonov, and decided no, they can't. My appeal has been, as far as I know, never seen by a human eye, and it was supposed to take 4 days, and months later, but Elon Musk doesn't care about that kind of censorship.
So you were blocked, or was...
Yeah, I posted a letter to Ambassador Antonov that made the, I guess you could say, threat that if his people continued to destroy my sunflowers that I'd planted across the street from the embassy, I would, for every sunflower plant that was destroyed, do an hour of projection of sunflowers on the embassy. And Facebook quickly took it down, and saying it was appeared to be misleading spam, which, I mean, like, I don't know how it resembled, ads for penis enlargement products but yeah, and so it's a good example.
Even if, I mean, that's more of an extreme case, right? But let's say your post had not been taken down. What I'm more concerned about is that there is an algorithm that determines who even sees your post. And it so happens is it'll direct it to people who are already anti-Russia, pro-Ukraine.
Right.
And I mean, you know this, we don't have to go through it, but to me, this is the main explanation of what's gone wrong, that we're now living in a country in which people have very little capacity to distinguish truth from falsehood, in which the information we get is directed to us by a machine that knows exactly what will make us the angriest, the most afraid, the most mistrustful of others. And you can't have a democratic polity. You can't have a country, a community, and if we can't agree on the same facts, if we don't start our debates every day from a foundation of common truth. And so,
which do you think is cause and which do you think is effect? The splintering of the media environment is both driving and caused by the splintering of the political environment, right? And I go back and forth with myself about which is the principal driver and which is the principal, drivee.
I'm sure I'm oversimplifying, because we all know there's not a single explanation for any complicated phenomenon. But think about how much has changed in the last 10 to 15 years in our politics. It so happens that similar changes have taken place everywhere in the world at the same time. Has human nature changed? No. Is there something in the water or the air that's different? No, I don't. I don't think so. Different cultures, different countries, with different histories, different recent political experiences, and yet this polarization has taken hold everywhere. And in some places, it's far worse than here. We've had genocides in countries like Burma and Ethiopia that can absolutely be traced back to people getting on social media. So I do think that the technology piece of this is a very big factor in explaining what's happened. And because it's a pretty concrete factor, it's something we can do something about rather than just bemoaning what has happened to human society. We have some control.
So just to give you a concrete example of your concrete example, both when this project was in lieu of fun during the pandemic and now, the same guiding spirit has been behind it, which is, what if you put relentless substance in front of all production values, or one might say any production values, in front of politics, in front of, what if you just said, we're going to have really serious conversations with really serious people at a very high level, and we're going to let, in a quite populist way, I might say, audience participate. So when Richard came on before and asked a question, I have no dismissal button. He dismissed himself when he was done with the question. He let himself in when I had to approve the letting himself in. So in some ways, it's very top down. I kind of run it. I schedule the guests, but in some ways, it's a kind of relentless substance project. It will not surprise you that it does not scale, right? So there is not, you get these little, and I do it because I think it's important to push back against the trends that you're describing. It's important to have serious conversations, and it's important that the material be there. But you never kid yourself that you can fight the machine. And, I have actually had conversations with YouTube about it, that there is this incredible body of public affairs programming that goes on every day at YouTube, and they don't curate it. If you had a team of news people at YouTube, I would drop anything to do this, by the way, that curated, that was like YouTube C-SPAN, everything interesting going on at YouTube, and it had its own place. That would be something, right? But it has to be driven by something other than the preferences, by the curatorial judgment of real people, rather than by the aggregated preferences of users.
So I know we came here to talk about Polish voters, but
hey, conversations migrate.
It's fine. It's not actually based on the aggregated preferences of users. Or in a sense it is. It's based on the aggregated subconscious preferences of users.
Correct.
So let me give you an example that's not...
The aggregated revealed preferences.
Correct.
The aggregated behaviors.
The behavior that they want is that you spend as much time on YouTube as possible. That's all they care about. So let me give you an example that is not about our politics, but about our mental health. If you're a teenage girl on Instagram, you start obsessively engaging with content that makes you unhappy. Is that your preference? If somebody asked you, is this what you want to be doing? Is this good for you? Is this good for the world, for your community? Would you say, yes, this is great? No. But you feel compelled to engage with it, maybe because your friends are, you think your friends are, or precisely because it makes you feel bad, you just kind of obsessively have to engage with it in some way. If you actually ask people, what in your conscious state do you want to spend your time on social media, on the internet doing? What people would tell you is very different from what what the algorithm is actually measuring. So this can be fixed if these platforms were to operate on that principle, which they could.
So do
They
you
could
see
measure
it as
people's
is it fundamentally a regulatory challenge? Is it fundamentally a challenge in creating a business model in which you're monetizing some other, like right now they're following the money?
Yeah.
What do you see the mechanism of mobility in the right direction here as looking like?
It's, I think, politics and law. So one thing, and I'll say this now as a practicing politician, we've been talking policy and theory, but as a practicing politician, I can tell you there are very few issues in America that are more unifying than hatred of big tech. I mean, I can get almost any audience to applaud if I'm going after big tech and social media, and particularly if you focus on harm to children.
And do you think that's because of the behavior of the companies, or do you think it's because they're big, they tend to be run by plutocratic smart boys who everybody hated in high school, and
All of that.
what's that?
It's all that. Yeah. I mean, it's the
Yeah.
substance, like people, particularly parents and teenagers who've grown up with this, like they can see the harm that it's doing. And they're the biggest, most powerful companies in the world, and we don't like that. And they happen to be run by James Bond villains, right? Not just big plutocrats, but like weird plutocrats who seem to want to take over the world.
Right, and are indignant that anybody questions their right to rule.
And so they're really easy they both deserve to be demonized, and they're really easy to demonize. And I continue to be surprised that more practicing politicians don't run on this. So, I mean, there's action now in Congress on protection of children. So that there's been some recognition, but really making this a dominant issue in our politics, I think the demand is there from the public, and that whichever party or group of leaders really seizes on this will be onto something that can get them elected again and again. And even the political side, like most Americans are fed up with the negativity and the anger. I mean, we're vulnerable to it. We're susceptible to that kind of politics, but we also know that it's bad and we don't like it. And so I think there's a lot of room here for, if the right president is elected, to take this on politically and to just challenge Musk and the people running Facebook and Meta. I mean, like, Meta now exists to basically cause all of us to stop interacting with other human beings in the real world and to start interacting with their avatars as we're strapped to headphones and machines in our houses. I mean, that is weird and creepy. I want to run against that.
So
and
do
then
you
there's a regulatory and legal side too. Like, you got to get rid of Section 230 so you can sue the hell out of it.
So when you say if the right politician wins, I mean, obviously Donald Trump is not going to take on Elon, and I mean, he would jump. He says jump, and Elon says how high. They clearly have a bro thing going. Do you have the impression that Kamala Harris has a fire in her belly about this set of issues? She did sue tech companies as attorney general. It's not an issue that she's talked about a great deal. And of course, part of being some of the most powerful companies in the world is having a lot of influence over politicians, particularly those from the Bay Area. Do you have the impression that a Kamala Harris administration would be characterized by a real put your head down and think about what to do about big tech approach?
I don't know. I hope so. I'm not going to do anything right now but help her get elected. But if that happens, my first question to her would be, do you want to go through this again? Assuming she's won by half a point in Pennsylvania. Do you want to go through this again and again and again? And you ran a great campaign. You spent $1 billion. You had by far the better argument. Your opponent was talking about immigrants eating cats and dogs, and you still only beat him by a point in Pennsylvania. We have to change something. And I'm sure she would also see the political and moral salience of the child protection and mental health piece of this. So we'll have to see. I worked a lot on this when I was in the House, and we had a bill to narrowly tailor Section 230 better because we thought that was more realistic than getting rid of it. And my co-sponsor was Congresswoman Anna Eshoo, who represents Facebook in the Silicon Valley and who helped write 230 in the 1990s. And she just reached her limit with the main employer, one of the main employers in her district.
Wow, that's actually really something. So going back to Polish voters and integrating it with the second part of the conversation, when you go to a town hall or a Polish American, event in Wilkes-Barre, and you think half the voters are got their mind made up for Trump, and you're working with a pretty small percentage of them. And where is the information streams that are in there? I don't have my device in my hand, but you can imagine it. That when you say the problem is this, what are the so this is the whorehouse, but what are the content problems that are overwhelming in the bordello that's in their hands?
That's not the metaphor I was thinking about, but thank you.
But it's, we're all either madams or whores.
It's the same as with any of us. They're getting information from multiple sources, curated by their social media platform, whatever it may be, for the most part. It's not just like people tuning into Fox News, right? It's the device that is determining what Fox News video or maybe what occasional mainstream media video or article they see. And there are Polish Americans who look at other Polish Americans and say, you're absolutely crazy, because that's what we're doing as Americans to each other. Each side thinks the other is completely mad because we're living in parallel realities when it comes to the information we're getting. So, okay, I think the argument, if you have any kind of Polish patriotism left in you, or you care about the fate of Ukraine, to me, it's just absolutely obvious. You can't vote for Trump, who's going to sell those countries to Putin for nothing. But to those on the other side, there's a lot of merit or power to the argument that Trump makes. Very simple. That, well, Putin didn't do this when I was president. It all happened, the invasion happened when Biden was president. So that's what they tell themselves. Things were better.
He never would have done this if I had been president.
And, This is a guy who, if it rains, says, well, it never would have rained if I were president. So you can point out how ridiculous that sounds to people. But if you're inclined to vote for Trump for other reasons, and then you have this nagging question, well, what about Ukraine? That's your permission structure. That's your excuse.
So I want to talk in the time we have remaining about the period between the election and the inauguration, which, will, in the event of a Trump victory, will be full of dread and outrages, but will be otherwise a fairly normal transition in the sense that I think, Joe Biden will behave like a patriot and will prepare the stage for his successor to the best that he can, as Obama did and as George W. Bush did for Obama. For obvious reasons, there's a lot less reason to be confident about both a peaceful transfer of power, but also sort of an orderly transfer of power, not between the executive branch and itself, but between the public. And you have a December meeting of the Electoral College in 50 state capitals, each of which could be the subject of violence. You have, of course, lots of opportunities to intimidate state election officials. And then, of course, you have the battle that we fought 4 years ago, which is, the certification itself or the counting of the electoral votes on January 6th. I go back and forth with myself about whether we're sort of fighting the last war on this one, and the anxiety that we have will be, whatever happens will be different from what we expect. And so you mentally prepare for what happened last time. And then, of course, something comes out of left field, and it's very hard to prepare for black swans. Or whether you look at, Trump actually likes the playing of old hits. And January 6th, which he still refers to the rioters as we. And that's an old hit for him at this point, and he talks about it nostalgically. Whether, we should be really concerned about sort of January 6th violence. And I'm just interested in how you're thinking about the post-election period in the event of a Harris win.
So in the days after January 6th, 2021, I personally felt that the safest place in America was inside the Capitol building for me as a member of the House. Most of my colleagues, or many of them, were terrified to go there for understandable reasons, having been through what they went through. I felt it was the safest place because, okay, now we've turned this into a fortress. I'm much more worried about going home to my district, to my house, where there's no security. Everybody knows where I live. Folks at an airport, there's so many unsecured places in the country. You can't secure everything. And I think that's probably still the case. If Harris wins, Trump won't accept it. There'll be something. And the Capitol area will be a massive fortress on the day that the election is certified, and nothing's going to get through. But I'm going to be much more worried about what happens in the swing states when they certify. I'm going to be worried about the security of these nice people who are electors in the Electoral College and who never, expected to do anything other than perform a ceremonial role. I'm going to be worried about judges and court employees, because if there are cases that come before them, the pressure will be immense. So rather than a single point at which the enemies of democracy converge to do violence, I'd be much more worried about a diffuse and more lasting set of challenges.
And I mean, one of the really great accomplishments of the last Congress was the passage of the Electoral Count Reform Act. No one's ever going to get a lot of credit for it because no one understands the process and the changes that were made, but they are actually important. And I do think they do not eliminate the risk of a rogue anti-democratic party refusing to accept the election. I don't think you can constitutionally eliminate that risk, but it does substantially mitigate the risk. Are you confident that, notwithstanding Speaker Johnson, notwithstanding the narrow Republican majority in the House, that at the end of the day, the votes as certified by the states, leaving aside the question of what machinations will go into those certifications, will be, assuming the mob is kept at bay, counted appropriately?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, so am I.
Yeah. That doesn't solve the entire problem, right? As what we have been discussing for the last half hour. But if Harris wins, she will be sworn in, and she will be our next president.
And when do you expect to know? I mean, I look at it and say, in my adult lifetime, there have been really only 2 elections where we didn't know either that night or the next morning. I think in Kerry's case, he didn't concede until the next morning. In Clinton's case, she didn't concede until the next morning. But we knew that night that it had.
Yeah.
There's 2000 where there was a legitimate dispute that took a month plus to resolve. And there was 4 years ago where it took really 4 or 5 days to finish counting the relevant states. What do you expect this year to be like, just in terms of elapsed time between the last polls closing and our knowing anything?
I think it'll be faster. Pennsylvania was the one we waited for, as I recall, in the last election. And
Arizona. Fox called Arizona, but it was the only one that called it for a long time.
Yeah. Remember, much higher percentage of mail-in ballots in 2020. And Pennsylvania wasn't allowed to start counting those ballots until election day, even if they'd come in long before. So it was just too much of a logistical challenge to do all of it that day.
And isn't that still true, that the Republicans in the Pennsylvania legislature refused to allow prep of ballots before?
Yeah, I think they have more resources now, and we expect fewer absentee ballots.
Gotcha.
So, now, if it's like Florida 2020 close, I'm sorry, Florida 2000 close.
Right, but that's legit.
Yeah.
I mean, if something's that close, if you have 580 ballots separating it, it's going to take a while to figure that out.
Yeah, and then, in any election, I mean, in my elections in New Jersey, there were absentee ballots trickling in for 2 weeks after the election.
Right, both times, right?
Yeah, and in 2020, it was an issue. I remember going to bed on election night 2020, having been told that I won my race by 10 points, but that Biden might be losing. And I felt absolutely horrible, even though I was sure that I'd won. And then 2 days later, Biden is the winner. and the late absentee ballots coming in my race were all trending to my opponent, and I had like 14 days of hell waiting for what ended up being an incredibly close outcome. But I don't think it's going to be like that this time. I think we're going to know faster.
So speaking of your most recent opponent, he has a tough race. What's that? Yeah, well, the virtues of the father turned out to be the sins of the son. He has a serious race this time again, or
Yes,
should we expect him to cruise to re-election?
He does. There's a wonderful woman named Sue Altman who is running against him. And there have been 3 polls in the last week that show him leading her by 1 or 2 points. So it's on
Anybody's race.
As a close race that could flip. It's a Republican. It was drawn to be a Republican district more even than the one that I won twice. That's what gave me the trouble in my last race. So it's tough for Democrat, but still winnable. And a lot of moderate Republicans here who are torn.
And why did you not run again?
That's a long story.
We have 3.5 minutes.
Oh my gosh. I wanted, I think, to take a little bit of time away from the constant struggle, which being a member of the House in a swing district entails. I loved the job. I loved being in the House of Representatives, but it does take a lot out of you to have that more than full-time job and the more than full-time job of constantly running because you have a target
right
on you that from the day you walk in. And I also thought actually having somebody new and fresh and undefined might give us a better chance to win this year because in 3 elections I had over $20 million in this little area spent calling me all kinds of creative things, and I have really strong loyal support, but also strong loyal opposition, right? So after 3 really tough elections, things are very polarized around me because I was at the center of all 3.
Did anybody find a video about you in Hindi?
No. We paid a lot of people to suppress all of those because it would have been as embarrassing as what you experienced.
Yeah, no, it was a tough week, though, the week that came out.
I can understand.
Tom Malinowski, you're a great American, in or out of Congress, in or out of the executive branch, sparring with me over killer robots or not. It's a pleasure to see your face. And
we should still talk about that at some point.
I'm sorry?
We should still talk about that at some point.
We should.
I'll take on your shot.
Should. And by the way, the lasers are, if you have thoughts about where in swing states they might make an appearance over the next few weeks, both of them, Lord and Lady Laser, have informed me that they are ready to defend democracy in the United States as well as in Ukraine. And so if there are sites in Philadelphia or in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, or in, Oshkosh, Wisconsin that scream out to you as these are things that should be lit up with the appropriate message, shoot me a text. Have lasers will travel.
I love it. Thank you, Ben.
We will talk to you soon. Hey, everybody, just a message. This is the second to last episode of Dog Shirt TV that will go live on YouTube. I have been dissatisfied with the quality of the live streams, and the quality of the posted video is dramatically higher. So as of the next episode with Pete Struck will be the last one that I live stream to YouTube. I will be posting the full videos right after I make them. But if you don't see forthcoming live streams upcoming, that's not because we're not making them. It's not because they won't show up there. It's only because they won't show up there live. We will be back. We have shows scheduled Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday of next week. A scheduling email will come through Dogshirt Daily, and we will see you very soon. Take care, Tom.